as they say, look good, play good, and the Falcons just announced that they plan to look real good in 2026.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Locked On Falcons, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, now the #1 sports podcast network in Matt Ryan's galaxy, right, as the president of football in this galaxy. And, of course, I'm your humble host, Aaron Freeman, been covering the Atlanta Falcons for almost 2 decades, formerly at falcfans.com, RIP, still going strong as the humble host of this illustrious podcast. We are now entering year 10 as the humble host of Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. And on today's daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, we will be talking about why the Falcons could be one of the 2 finalists for John Harbaugh. We'll talk about if Klint Kubiak is the potential solution to the problem that the Falcons have been chasing for the better part of the last decade. But we got to start today's episode with the big news of the day. Falcons are getting new uniforms in 2026. Yes, they dropped a teaser on social media that new uniforms are coming in April of this upcoming season. So everybody around the world, right, is excited, right? Getting new uniforms. It's provocative. It gets the people going. And this is the culmination of basically 4 weeks of rumors. I mean, really, the Falcons have been rumored to be potentially on the horizon. New uniforms have been on the horizon for like several years. And Zach Cohen on Twitter, sort of teased this a month ago, basically saying, the Falcons have filed for new uniforms, and this is basically confirmation of that. And, since Zach seems to be on the ball, and maybe we'll get Zach on the podcast at some point between now and when those uniforms drop to discuss it further, Zach's sort of teased, red helmets, throwback-inspired sort of uniforms, which automatically makes you think red helmets, but, red jersey, gray pants, some of these things that we're seeing, updated logo. I know that was something that Zach mentioned last month when he dropped this. Now, my personal favorite, right, were the Falcons uniforms when I first became a fan, right, was the 90s uniforms, the black helmets, the gray pants. I would love to see the Falcons go back to that. I've missed that for basically the last, almost 25 years since they haven't really had that. So even if that's not the main inspiration of these throwback inspired, because again, the implications and the suggestions are that it's going to be much more inspired by the red helmets and how the Falcons jerseys looked in the 60s and 70s than what they looked like in the 90s. But, if they can, essentially what I'm arguing is like, if the Falcons main uniform is red helmet stuff, then their throwback that they can throw out there 3 or 4 times could be the black helmets with the gray pants. I would at least appreciate that, because those are my favorite Falcon jerseys for me personally, because they were quite impressionable when I first came to this team in the 90s. But I say all that to basically say this next part, which is, honestly, I don't care that much about whether or not the Falcons get new jerseys. I care about them winning games, and it's not to suggest that those 2 things are mutually exclusive. Like, if you care about what the jerseys look like, you don't care about the team winning game. I suspect for the vast majority of the fan base, that Venn diagram of how much do you care about wins, how much do you care about jerseys, it's a circle, right? There's a perfect overlap with that. But I just know for me, like, they could be out there butt naked. That would be certainly would draw eyeballs, but if they're winning games, I'm like, hey, man, let it hang, right? But, I think really what this does, all that nonsense aside, this does build buzz for this upcoming season, right? And it's part of the reason why now you look back in hindsight where it's like, yeah, they kind of had to fire these folks, because it's like you get this new look, you got a new era and this new look, and then you got the same old guys that have basically, consistently gone 8-9 or 7-10 the last several years, and you're like, oh, they look good, but I don't think they're going to play that much better. And now, at least with the new management coming in, with Matt Ryan, with as the president of football in the entire galaxy, and the new head coach and new GM, you now actually have potential, hype to build for this new season, right? It's a new era, it's a new look, it's just perfect synergy, right? In the business world, that's what we call synergy, right? It markets itself. And again, I'm not trying to be too cynical about this stuff, right? You got to get the butts in the seats, right? Blank was asked at his press conference last week about the no-shows, and is he concerned about that? And he basically, I liked Arthur Blank's answer for that. He was like, this is a symptom of the disease, right? It's not the no-shows that's the problem. The no-shows are indicating that, the product on the field isn't good, right? And, I think far too often the discourse surrounding Atlanta sports fans is like, oh, well, the disease is the fan. And it's like, no, the fan is a symptom of the disease. The disease is not winning, enough in whatever games that we're talking about, whether we're talking the Hawks, the Falcons, the Braves, etc. Right? It's the same thing where it's like, the cough, the fever, the runny nose. Those are symptoms of your affliction, of the disease, right? The disease is the actual virus itself, the bacteria that is attacking your body and trying to replicate itself, and your immune system is fighting it. And right, the Falcons' disease is not winning, right? And the no-shows are a symptom of that. And so, we, have advanced our medicine to the point where our medicine treats the symptoms, right? And that's sort of allows your immune system to go out there and fight the disease. And basically what I'm sitting here saying, if you're following my analogy, is the uniforms are the medicine, right? They're going to get the butts back in the seats, and the butts back in the seats is the symptom of the disease. But hopefully, the new president of football in the entire solar system, along with the head coach, along with the GM, right? They're going to be fighting that disease of not winning, and so it's all going to work out in their favor. But since we're talking about diseases, right? There has been an affliction that has plagued this organization for 9 years. It is the lack of Kyle Shanahan-itis. And the question is Klint Kubiak potentially the cure for that disease? And we'll break that down as we continue today's Locked On Falcons. Now, we know the Falcons' history of hiring good coaches is not so illustrious. They find a lot of people that look good on paper, and then you find out later it's not quite the right fit. If only NFL teams had Indeed-sponsored jobs, today's sponsor of Locked On Falcons, to help them find the right match. Now, if you're not an NFL team and you're hiring, Indeed is all you need. Stop struggling to get your job post seen on other sites. Indeed's sponsored jobs put your post at the top of the page and help you reach the right candidates faster. Indeed sponsored jobs helps your listing stand out and reach quality candidates faster. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs posted directly on Indeed are 90% more likely to report a hire than non-sponsored jobs. So spend more time interviewing candidates who check all your boxes with less stress, less time, and more results using Indeed sponsored jobs. Get a $75 sponsored job credit to help give your job the premium placement it deserves at Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL. Just go to Indeed.com/LockedOnNFL right now and support the show by saying you heard about Indeed on this podcast. Terms and conditions apply. Hiring, do it the right way with Indeed. Now, it is a new year, new systems, not just for the Falcons, but for everyone, since this is the time when a lot of us look at the messier parts of how we run our business and think, there's got to be a better way. And there is. Streamlining your communications is one of the quickest upgrades you could make. That's why today's episode is brought to you by Quo, spelled Quo, the smarter way to run your business communications, because when your team is reachable, organized, and communicating one place, you're not just working cleaner, you're creating more opportunities to connect with customers. Your whole team can call and text from one shared business number so nothing gets missed, and everyone sees the full conversation thread, which makes replies faster and more personal. It's no surprise, Quo is the #1 rated business phone system on G2, trusted by more than 90,000 businesses, from solo operators to growing teams. Make this year where no opportunity and no customer slips away by trying Quo for free. Plus, get 20% off your first 6 months when you go to quo.com/LockedOnNFL. That's QUO.com/LockedOnNFL. Quo, no missed calls, no missed customers. So continuing with today's Locked On Falcons, want to thank all of you that are everydayers of the podcast. You are the reason why Locked On is now the #1 sports podcast network in Matt Ryan's solar system. And of course, if you want to level up your everydayerness All you got to do is join the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below at lockedonfalcons.supercast.com, where you can find all the various perks like an ad-free version of the podcast, Locked On Podcast Network Discord server, some merch, right? $5 a month, $50 a year is all it takes to level up your everydayers. So go check it out at the link in the description below. So let's talk about Klint Kubiak, right? He's potentially one of the hot names in this coaching cycle. He's one of 4 candidates that the Falcons officially interviewed over the weekend. We'll certainly get through some of the other candidates as well as future candidates as the week wears on, right? But as I said, Kubiak's going to be a hot name this cycle. He's considered by many to be that next offensive guru. And really that's the case for why you like Klint Kubiak potentially as a Falcons hire is based off of the potential for him to be that next offensive guru, right? The reason why you want to hire an offensive guru, we talked about it where, Terry Fontenot was mismatched for the Atlanta Falcons and why that, his philosophy in terms of team building, that aggressive trade up mentality, that one piece away mentality worked in New Orleans, but didn't work in Atlanta, primarily because in New Orleans, you had that offensive guru in Sean Payton, plus the quarterback in Drew Brees, that gives you more stability and more success, right? Offensive success drives team success in today's NFL, right? But the challenge has been these last couple of years, all the other NFL teams know that. And it's been increasingly harder to hit on those offensive gurus, that next offensive guru, because it feels like really since that 2019 coaching cycle when everybody, that was a coaching cycle where everybody who was like adjacent to Zach Taylor or Kyle Shanahan got a job. It seemed like that offseason. And pretty much every sort of McVay Shanahan disciple, as those guys are kind of the gold standard for the offensive guru, given their success over these last 9 years in their respective places, every single one of their disciples seems to get a job. And, it's led to a lot of success. Matt LaFleur, Kevin O'Connell, Zach Taylor, Mike McDaniel, Liam Cohen, right? Again, no rings among any of these people, but certainly all of those guys, at least initially when they went to their places of employment, were able to have success. We'll see, whether or not they can have ongoing success moving forward. And, the challenge for the Falcons is like they also have been chasing this sort of offensive guru, right, with their offensive coordinator hires as well as a few head coaching hires since Kyle Shanahan was here back in 2016, right? They got a taste of the sweet ambrosia that is having an offensive genius / guru as your play caller, and that was the reason why the Falcons got to the Super Bowl. And, like it or not, the Falcons have been kind of chasing that high ever since, right? They brought in Steve Sarkisian and Dirk Cutter after Kyle Shanahan, basically, and Dan Quinn was like, do your best Kyle Shanahan impression. They didn't quite live up to the standard, and that kind of cost Dan Quinn his job. Then they bring in Arthur Smith, who's Kyle Shanahan, Sean McVay adjacent, because he spent time with Matt LaFleur in Tennessee, and it's like, okay, well, he's kind of Kyle Shanahan adjacent, right? That didn't quite work out. And then we hire Raheem Morris, and he brings in Zach Robinson, who's a McVay disciple, and it's like, hey, do your best Sean McVay impression, and that hasn't quite worked out, right? But it's like, hey, Klint Kubiak, this time it might work for us, right? And he's someone that you can imagine a situation where Matt Ryan, now, again, the president of football on the holy world of Terra, could be attracted to, because Matt Ryan firsthand knows how successful that offensive style, that McVay Shanahan offense and its derivatives can be, right? He had a lot of success. He won an MVP, and he helped guide the Falcons to, a game that I don't recall if that game happened. Anyway, so he could also be chasing that. And you look at Klint Kubiak's offensive system, and you see a guy that understands that marriage between the run and the pass when it comes to the play action. That's what he's majored in. That's what these McVay Shanahan disciples and the successful ones have been able to do. And the unsuccessful ones that have primarily been in Atlanta these last 8+ years have not been able to do. And so you're like, okay, like maybe he can get it right? And obviously he has the pedigree. His dad was a very successful NFL head coach. He's seen a lot of football. He's grown up around the NFL. We talked about how Zach Robinson struggled with this marrying the run game with the passing game, right? You start with the run game and you build your passing game off of it. That's what the McVay Shanahan disciples do, right? Now, to Zach Robinson's credit, they did eventually figure out the play action stuff in the last 3 months of the season in 2025. The Falcons had one of the best play action passing attacks in the NFL, over their last, I'm trying to do the math in my head, 13 games, right? Number 2 in the NFL in EPA per play off of play action over the last 13 games of the season, which is actually better than the Seahawks, who were number 5 over that span of the season. Now, we're not going to get into the whole under center versus pistol stuff. We're going to probably do a deeper dive of that this offseason once I do a little bit more research. But I've done some preliminary research, right? A big selling point of Klint Kubiak and why so many people are attracted to him is because they are like, Zach Robinson didn't do enough under center stuff, and Klint Kubiak's going to do under center stuff, right? Now, under center, basically the preliminary research says that when you compare under center play action versus pistol-based play action, under center is more stable, it's more reliable, and generally outperforms sort of the pistol stuff. But again, we'll do a deeper dive into that sort of notion. But based off of that, you sort of look at that and say, okay, Klint Kubiak's play action offense is going to be a lot more reliable, a lot more stable, and generally outperform what we've seen from Zach Robinson and others these last couple of years. Now, we'll see on that front. But, I think there are 2 main concerns with Klint Kubiak. Why you can sit there and go like, yeah, he's good, but, I do have some questions, right? And I don't know if they're red flags, but they're more like yellow flags, right? I think one is the tendency that his offense has to regress as the season wears on, right? That the version of the Klint Kubiak offense in September tends to outperform the version of the offense in December/January. That typically you get a top 5, top 10 offense in September. And by the time you get to December, and this has been a consistent trend over the 3+ years that he's been a play caller, you're getting much more of a below average offense when it comes to its sort of advanced metrics and performance and whatnot. So that is a concern, mostly because if your offense isn't necessarily firing on all cylinders at the end of the season, you wonder, what does that mean when it comes to postseason success? Now, we'll get another data point on this front, later this week on Saturday when the Seahawks face the 49ers. And if, Klint Kubiak's offense looks, like a top 5, top 10 unit against a very beat up 49ers team, that will at least be a feather in the hat, where it does suggest that, maybe his offenses don't quite run out of gas as the narrative suggests. It's not sort of a stark sort of drop off or anything like that, like it is with like Cliff Kingsbury. I'm sorry, not Klint Kubiak. We're going to make that mistake probably one too many times. But, it is enough where you're like, is this a trend? And so it's something to keep an eye on. That's why I say it's a yellow flag more so than a red flag. The other issue I think that is also a yellow flag, that is a concern, but may not necessarily be a deal breaker, is, to quote Hawk blogger on Twitter who did a big breakdown of Klint Kubiak. He's not a dynamic personality. He's kind of an introverted guy. He's kind of a quiet, low-key guy. And I don't think that's a huge issue, but it's a question of, can he command a room, right? That's always a talk of when it comes to coaches. Can you command a room? And, I don't know if that's like the end-all, be-all of the world. That's why, again, it's a yellow flag. But it is at least an issue where it's like, I think that puts pressure on Klint Kubiak to hire the right staff, to have more of those more outgoing personalities on his coaching staff that can have that command of the room. Because again, not every player on your 53-man roster is going to respond to, that sort of quiet, low-key coaching the same way. And some of those guys might need a little bit more of that raw type of guy. And, I do think it can be a little bit easier, potentially, to lose the locker room if you're not that type of raw guy, especially if you're not winning games. Now, it's not sort of, cut and dry or anything like that, but I do tend to think it's like, if you're going to be that type of coach, that more introverted type of coach, you kind of have to be kind of a genius, a guru, an X's and O's guys, because you're not going to be able to use energy to get people to buy in. It's going to be like, oh, I trust this guy because like we're getting the results on the field. And that to me is the question right now with Klint Kubiak, where it's like, you can see him being very successful in the NFL, like some of those top McVay, Shanahan disciples. But is he, we sat here 2 years ago being like, Zach Robinson's going to be the next one. And then he didn't live up to that. And so you do wonder a little bit about that with Klint Kubiak, but at least Klint Kubiak has a much more proven track record. But, we'll see. We'll see on that. So those are the two concerns. Again, neither of those are like, oh my God, Klint Kubiak's a bad hire or anything like that. But it is something that, in the future, if you're struggling to put your kids to sleep, you might turn on a Klint Kubiak press conference to help, tucker them out, and they'll go right to bed or something like that. But I think, this is probably not going to be that huge an issue just because Klint Kubiak has been around the NFL for a long time. His dad wasn't necessarily a rah-rah guy, a big energy guy, those guys that typically can get away with just kind of being more vibes oriented than necessarily needing to be like that meticulous X's and O's genius that I think a much more, low-key guy like a Klint Kubiak is supposed to be. But at least with his dad, Gary Kubiak, Gary was a quarterback, right? Career backup in the NFL, but, by nature of playing that position, you have some command of a team and of a room, and Clint wasn't a quarterback, right? Raised by a quarterback, but he played wide receiver and safety in high school and played safety in college at Colorado State and whatnot. And so, again, I'm not shaming introversion, right? I'm an introvert myself, right? And I would love to believe in my wildest fantasies. If I had the right X's and O's, right? Not saying I do, but I'm saying, like, hypothetically, I could be a great NFL head coach doing that and whatnot. But I think it does have the potential to hurt you in those interviews, right? You saw this with kind of Kellen Moore, where kind of more of a low-key guy sort of got passed up on a couple of cycles, then eventually only got hired after he coordinated a team to the Super Bowl. And so we'll see on that front. But again, Kellen Moore was a quarterback, so it's a little different in that regard. So, we'll probably, let's say, I won't say probably. If he gets hired, we'll do a deeper dive on his offense schematically. But it's a 3.5. It's a solid to good 3.5 year body of work. 3 years, Minnesota, New Orleans, and this year in Seattle. I forgot about the half year where he took over play calling midway through that 2022 season with the Broncos when Nathaniel Hackett was the head coach, and his offenses with Russell Wilson were better, but it was kind of just like, we're just going to run the ball and we're going to play action and we're going to do 2 tight ends and we're just going to get back to basics to sort of salvage this offense. And it didn't salvage the offense, but it did outperform, the Nathaniel Hackett version of that offense. And so, I sit here and I say all that to basically say, of all the Shanahan imitators that we've seen in Atlanta, Sark Cutter, Arthur Smith, Zach Robinson, I think it's fair to say that Klint Kubiak's probably the best bet to get as close to Kyle Shanahan as we have gotten over these last couple of years. But I think that comes with an issue, right? Should the Falcons be chasing that sweet ambrosia that they have been chasing for the 9 years since Kyle Shanahan's departure, or should they be trying something brand new? And it's part of the reason why that has been contributing to the Falcons consistently coming up short in 8 of the last 9 years in terms of missing the playoffs, is because they're constantly trying to chase that high that they had in 2016, and they just need to just kind of start all over. And again, your mileage may vary on that. I've talked to Falcon fans that are still very much of that mindset. Let's try to find, a Shanahan disciple and get back there. And I've talked to Falcon fans that, feel like the Falcons need to have a, hard break from that sort of strategy. I'm curious what you guys think. So please provide your feedback in the comments below, or hit me up at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. Or if you're a Locked On Falcons insider, you can also hit me up there at the link in the description below for free, 14-day free trial, then $4.99 a month after that point. But those are my thoughts, kind of my broad sort of general thoughts on Klint Kubiak and his fit in Atlanta. We'll talk a little bit more about, the latest on the coaching search, including if Atlanta is the top option for John Harbaugh. And we'll break that down to wrap up today's Locked On Falcons. So let's be real. When you start your business, tax withholdings and managing payroll spreadsheets, what's the last thing on your mind? But thankfully, there's Gusto to take the stress out of payroll, benefits, and HR so that you can focus on running your business and supporting your team. Gusto is the all-in-one remote-friendly payroll and HR platform that makes managing your team simple, transparent, and fast. Whether you're hiring, onboarding, or paying employees, Gusto is going to help you do it all from one place without the hassle or the hidden fees. Gusto will save you hours each week with their automated tools like offer letters, onboarding materials, and direct deposits. And you'll get real peace of mind knowing that you can reach a certified HR expert anytime when you need it. Try Gusto today at gusto.com/LockedOnNFL and get 3 months free when you run your first payroll. That's right, 3 months of free payroll at gusto.com/LockedOnNFL. One more time, that's gusto.com/LockedOnNFL. And today's episode is also sponsored by FanDuel, with the wild card round being here. Right, Monday is the last stance of the wild card round. FanDuel is officially in playoff mode. Every game day during the NFL playoffs, FanDuel is giving customers more ways to get in on the action, because right now, for every NFL playoff game day, FanDuel users get a profit boost pack waiting for them inside the app. Each game day, you'll see a pack loaded with multiple profit boosts that you can apply to the bets that you like the most. Open your profit boost pack first thing on game day and see what boosts you want to apply. You know, whether you want to lean in on your game day instincts like backing the momentum, defense, quarterback, or coaching, these boosts are going to give more juice on the bets that you actually like, instead of forcing you to bet on something new and different that you don't like. So make your picks, then apply your profit boost and go after even bigger payouts while the playoffs get rolling. So visit FanDuel, the official sportsbook partner of the NFL, and grab your profit boost pack every NFL playoff game day. So John Harbaugh, we heard over the weekend John Harbaugh was going to take some time, assess the situation, and get into it this week, and he's starting to get into it. Several reports come out in the last 24 hours from people that not only cover the New York Giants as well as national people, that the Giants and Falcons are his top two options. There were reports over the weekend that he was really focusing on watching Jackson Dart and Cam Ward film, right? And he was like, is he watching Michael Penix film? And, it made it seem like maybe the Falcons weren't going to be in the running based off of those reports. But now he's setting up interviews, and the Falcons did announce Monday that they did conduct an interview with John Harbaugh, but multiple insiders are reporting that this is not necessarily as formally an interview. It's more of a preliminary call, air quotes, that he's taking with multiple teams, and sort of looking for what those teams' best pitch are, and then helping him line up sort of the priority of it, right? There have been rumors about John Harbaugh's contract demands and whatnot, coming out of Cleveland. A lot of that was speculation. He may wind up getting those things like a $20 million salary, a high budget for his coaching staff and control over personnel, but multiple much more reliable insiders have been suggesting that those aren't demands. Those are just sort of a natural byproduct of, being a successful coach. And that speculation is just mostly people connecting dots as opposed to actually hearing that he has these firm demands. And so, I kind of think of this first interview, air quotes, interview as kind of a situation like we had 2 years ago with Bill Belichick, right? Where Bill Belichick had two interviews with the Atlanta Falcons. The first one was a kind of a solo one where Belichick and Blank, met on Arthur Blank's yacht. And then the second one was much more of a formal interview. I think it was like 4 or 5 days later, where you had other people in that room interviewing and talking. And so I imagine like this first one, if we're like, this is a preliminary call and a couple of people were on the phone with John Harbaugh, he'll line up a much more in-person formal interview in the coming days. And that will be the true interview as opposed to what this Monday one was, but we'll sort of see. We'll probably get a little bit more clarity on that in the coming days. Now, talk about Mike McDaniel. He's reportedly going to be interviewing with the Falcons Monday night as I'm recording this. That has not been formally announced, but it probably has been once you guys are actually listening to this. Again, Mike McDaniel being, another Shanahan disciple. We've seen the flashes of the elite offense that he had. My questions with Mike McDaniel surround sort of, can he achieve a high degree of success when he doesn't necessarily have that elite speed that he had at the peak of the Miami days with Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle? Because receivers with that type of game-breaking speed don't grow on trees, right? Those are relatively rare in the NFL. And the Dolphins had two of those guys, as well as, Devon Achane, one of the most explosive running backs in the NFL. And so, can McDaniel's offense work when he doesn't have necessarily elite, 10 out of 10 speed at all, his skill position roles? And that to me remains to be seen, because that's not the situation in Atlanta. Obviously, if that is the case, then the Falcons need to go out there and get that. I think the Falcons need to go out there and add more speed in their skill room regardless of who their head coach is, but that becomes potentially more pressing if Mike McDaniel is, potentially the Falcons' next coach. And so the question with Mike McDaniel is going to be the question we have with a lot of these retreads, including John Harbaugh, but not quite the same. It's just going to be, are you going to be better in your second stint, right? Because as we talked about, before the Dolphins absolutely punked the Falcons in Week 8 this year, we talked about how the vibes in Miami were really, really bad and had been bad since the end of the 2024 season. They were able to kind of turn that around, but obviously not to the degree to save Mike McDaniel's job. The question, of course, is how much of an appetite is there going to be for retreads in Atlanta, given that we kind of just went down this road with Raheem Morris. And, that matters, I think, more for people like Mike McDaniel and Kevin Stefanski, that similar to Raheem Morris, there were a lot of red flags with how their tenures ended in their respective places. Mike McDaniel, Miami, Cleveland with Stefanski these last 2 years, as opposed to, say, a Mike McCarthy or John Harbaugh, who are a little bit more proven, and you don't, you can still nitpick their tenures, but there's less nitpicks. It's like, the overwhelming, even their down years were not like super down, where like the vibes were like terrible, like it was how it ended at points in Miami and in Cleveland and whatnot, in Baltimore and Dallas. So that to me is an open question. And so we'll see what the appetite for that is. But obviously, we have a president of football of Taiwan, here running things. And so, how we'll see. Again, what Matt Ryan's proclivities are or may not necessarily be affected by the sort of recency bias that other people in that building might have. As we often know that when you fire a coach, you try to move away from what you just, hired in the last cycle. So we'll see. So the last tidbit I'll say before we wrap things up here is, now that we're 48 hours removed from Matt LaFleur, the reports are now, Matt LaFleur's collapse in Chicago, I should say. And we talked about this yesterday. The reports are that the Packers and Matt LaFleur are working on an extension. I wouldn't necessarily conclude that means that Matt LaFleur will definitely be back in Green Bay, because you got to remember last year at the end of the season, there were reports that Mike McCarthy and Dallas were working on an extension until they weren't, and then they decided to mutually part ways. And I think that's notable with the Matt LaFleur situation, because we kind of mentioned in passing on yesterday's episode that if the Packers and LaFleur decide to mutually part ways, that could lead to the Packers looking for a trade. And I know Locked On Packers host Peter Bukowski has sort of talked a little bit about that on Twitter. I'm sure he'll probably get more into that on his show. So go check it out, Locked On Packers. We'll have more insight into the ongoing drama and saga that is Matt LaFleur in Green Bay, and whether or not he'll stay in Green Bay. But again, I think that's something worth reiterating. And you wonder a little bit, okay, what can the Falcons really offer, given they don't have a first-round pick this year? And so if that's the case, could they get outbid for Matt LaFleur? Again, don't know the answers, don't know if that it'll come down to that, but just something to keep an eye on in these coming days. So we'll see on that front. But that's going to do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons. Again, check out all the great shows across the Locked On Podcast Network to get more insight for what's going on elsewhere in the NFL. Tomorrow on Locked On Falcons, I believe we will be joined by Alan Stirk, right? Original co-host of the Locked On Falcons podcast, as well as the Falcons Fans podcast. And we'll get his insight into the Falcons coaching search, the Matt Ryan hire. We'll probably talk a little bit about the All-Pros. I know we haven't mentioned that on the podcast. The Falcons got 4 All-Pros, so I think that's worth discussion, because, I know Alan has been supportive of the idea of bringing back Kyle Pitts, and so we can have I have not been, and so we can have a little bit of debate potentially on tomorrow's episode. So go check that out. Check us out on YouTube, wherever you listen to podcasts. And again, check out the Everydayer Club at the link in the description below. Locked On Falcons at Supercat, LockedOnFalcons.supercast.com. $5 a month, $50 a year. Level up your everydayerness. Get that ad-free version of Locked On Falcons, as well as other perks that you can check out at the link in the description below. It is all part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every stinking